Okay, and you are back with Transcending Politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr., and I'm here today with a friend of mine and a colleague at Better Angels, Mr. Blake Phillips. Blake, thank you so much for being out here to talk to us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, Blake, you and I got to know each other a little bit at the Better Angels convention, and we wound up speaking after that a little. And I was impressed in some of our conversations with your knowledge about things, the area of economics and beyond, that I myself still feel myself to be a bit of an amateur with respect to. And so I thought it would be great for us to talk a little bit about some of the things that I think are confusing people today about what's going on in the economy, who deserves the credit or the blame for what. And we'll jump into all of that. To say a little bit about you very quickly, though, just by way of introduction, I'll say very quickly that you've got a much more impressive resume than I do, so maybe I shouldn't read from it too much. But you're currently in the past you had worked as research assistant to the Director of Monetary Affairs of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. You work currently with the Fulbright Association as Director of Advocacy in the Capital Area Chapter. A lot of people are, I think, sort of familiar with the Fulbright program. At least I had heard of it, so it wasn't completely new to me. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about your work. And I also mentioned just very quickly that you are a regional coordinator for Better Angels in Washington, D.C. Did I get that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Fantastic. Yeah. Tell us very quickly a little bit about what you do with Fulbright, since that's your current post.
Of course. So for my current post with Fulbright, so I'm on the board of directors for the Fulbright Association, the National Capital Area Chapter. So we're the locals organization in Washington D.C. It's essentially the Fulbright Association itself is the official alumni organization for the U.S. Fulbright program. The U.S. Fulbright program is an international exchange program sponsored by the U.S. State Department. It's in 165 countries around the world, and we have about 8,000 both Americans going abroad and foreigners coming to the United States each year. And there's about 380,000 alumni around the world, and so we're helping to connect those alumni and to advocate on behalf of the program. And ultimately, the goal of the program is ultimately to make the world a smaller place, to increase the mutual understanding across cultural barriers, across religious barriers, across linguistic and different barriers. And actually, in part, I think that's where my interest in Better Angels came from as well, was I realized the incredible power of public diplomacy and cross-cultural exchange in order to really break down barriers. And that's something that I enjoyed doing, because I myself spent a year teaching English at a rural secondary school in Malaysia, and I incredibly fascinating experience there. And I enjoyed that, and I saw the immense power of that to change the way that people saw each other and saw themselves in the broader world. And so I really wanted to kind of take that and figure out how can we utilize that power, the power of just human exchange, of human dialogue, back and forth with each other, and essentially apply it to domestic politics. And that's what we're trying to figure out how to do here in Washington, D.C. through Better Angels. And there's a number of other organizations which are working on similar things. And so I'm very grateful to have the chance to see what I can do on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, man. Well, we need folks like yourself. There's no doubt about it. Now, your experience is interesting because you have, I would imagine, you've developed an international perspective on what's going on within the United States domestically. In other words, you've interacted with people in different cultural and national circumstances.
Yeah.
And I suppose you've had an opportunity that most Americans don't have to sort of reflect on what it means to be an American from outside of the country. How do people, and I know that this is a question that probably has a range of answers, so I'd love to get your sense from your own experience of the spectrum here. But how do people outside of the United States tend to look at the United States and at Americans? Is there a general answer you can give to that, or some spectrum of attitudes that you can describe for us, those of us who have not ventured far beyond these shores?
So essentially the question is what attitudes, or what prevailing attitudes do foreigners have of Americans of the United States?
Yeah, right. How do people feel about us internationally?
I mean, it really depends. I mean, my experience in Malaysia, people were incredibly friendly. They're very open, welcoming, and generous. I mean, certainly there's well-known stereotypes about Americans, both that we tend to be on the larger side, that we tend to be fairly outspoken,
Hmm.
uh, that, I mean, and certainly people know us kind of through, I mean, everyone knows the CIA, for
Mm.
example, or they know, I mean, they know a lot about the military, they know a lot about US foreign policy. They end up hearing a lot about our political system as well and see us as, and so I think it's a mix. I mean, so we're seen as being one of the beacons of democracy around the world. I think that's one of our strengths. That said, and especially for a country such as Malaysia, which is predominantly conservative and predominantly conservative and Muslim, there is a fairly strong concern about certain aspects of U.S. foreign policy, and that's a place where I was able to have an impact by talking with people and kind of talking through U.S. foreign policy, because people did know a lot, but there's also a lot that they didn't know, or they'd only heard in certain aspects of U.S. foreign policy, and so I was able to provide a little bit more depth and substance to that, as well as talking about U.S. politics, because a lot of times they kind of just hear the broad headlines, and a lot of times they can often lose the substance, like the nuance involved with the U.S. political process, and it's even something for, as an American myself, it's a lot to keep track of.
Right.
Uh, so I mean, the U.S. is interesting that way because it is. I mean, ultimately, I think that the question you asked, which I think is really interesting, is basically what ultimately makes us American, and that's something which I struggled with a decent amount overseas in Malaysia. But I think that was a really important thing because ultimately, I was trying to think about essentially what makes American America, and at least for me, a lot of it was a question of political ideals. That
Mhm.
ultimately, it's a question of citizenship, and I think that's one of the amazing things about the United States is that we do have people coming from all over the world, and ultimately, it's almost like an allegiance to a broader sense, a set of political ideals of democracy and rule of law, of individual responsibility, which I think is ultimately what makes the United States such an incredible place, both for Americans who were born here, but also for immigrants as well. And really appreciate that part about the United States because I think it has given me incredible opportunities, and for so many other people. And so, but it's less defined than certain other places where you can have a clearer sense of blood and soil, or
Right.
that what it means to be French is more of a French heritage.
Mhm.
There's, given that the United States is such a new country, there's less of that history there, and so I think it's one of the strengths of the United States is that we can adapt, and there is a certain flexibility there that I think ultimately it's about political ideals. That's essentially the fundamental uh, aspect holding together the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the beauty of the American experiment, the idea that anybody can be a part of this experiment and be a part of that legacy without having any sort of ethnic or class-based connection to the groups that founded this nation. But you mentioned the fact that people around the world look at the United States as a leader in democracy. Does our current political polarization shake the confidence that people have in our political leadership in that sense internationally? Are you getting a sense of that international concern for the state of American politics currently?
I mean, so I actually haven't been abroad for a couple of years now, unfortunately.
Sure.
That I do interact with a lot of current Fulbrighters visiting from other countries, and certainly there is a lot of concern. I mean, I think that so when I was abroad in Malaysia, President Obama was our political leader at the time, and I think and certainly he was well received in Malaysia, both given his background in Indonesia, as well as kind of being more internationalist and more of a globalist in perspective. And there certainly is concerns that the United States, I think, is turning more inwards, that it's becoming a little more populist, a little bit more nationalist.
Mhm.
Um, Certainly, I mean, I would still argue that the United States is still the gold standard for basically as leadership around the world. That said, I mean, I think people are still trying to figure out what this new world looks like, and I think even in the United States, I think there's still kind of a struggle figuring out, okay, well, what's the United States' role in the world, and ultimately, has the global leadership role that the United States has played historically, is that the correct one? Is that one that's beneficial to the United States for our national interest and for our people? And personally, I think it is. That said, I think it's a fair debate to have, and I think in some ways a healthy debate to have. And so I don't necessarily want to squash that debate. That said, I haven't necessarily been a fan of at least some of the proponents of kind of the other side of the way that they've promoted their arguments. That said, I think it's a helpful and healthy dialogue to have as a country.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the different sides of the debate domestically here. First of all, when it comes to the economy in general, I've had the sense for a while that we tend to focus on sort of a narrow range of factors that influence the things that are going on in the broader economic environment. And we have a tendency to look at these narrow factors and tie them very closely to the actions of one political party or another. And so I want to get into talking about the current administration, talk about their economic performance and so forth. But one more broad question before we jump directly into that. What would you say are the biggest problems facing the American economy right now that nobody is talking about, or at least that are not paid sufficient attention to in the broader conversation?
I actually don't have a terribly great answer for that question. I think that most issues that I'm aware of and that I'm concerned about have received decent amount of attention in the media.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly an era of incredibly fast change.
Yeah.
And I think people are still trying to figure out how to wrap their minds around it. And I think there's some fundamental structural issues and structural changes which are happening, which I think it's still working itself out, and I think it's still hard for even kind of myself who has studied these issues for a long time. And for example, I did spend a couple of years in the Federal Reserve. I think it's still even hard for me to really fully wrap my head around how the global economy works, of how automation and the rise of AI and other forms of automation, about what that makes, is essentially what the solutions are. That ultimately, I think that the fundamental problem is that I think there actually is a lack of really easy solutions to a series of really difficult questions, and ones that require a lot of thought and deep analysis. And so the concern is that the current political climate that we have, in some ways we're so polarized and everything is about political points, that's actually hard to really kind of get down to the meat of a lot of those issues in a way which actually addresses the nuance and complexity of those issues. And so I guess probably that would be my plea would be for like the American public and for the media overall to be able to dive into some of the complexity and some of that nuance, because there are no clear and easy answers, at least in my opinion, about where we are and where we're going and what the answers should be.
Right. Yeah. Well, I definitely agree with that. And I think that if I were to sort of characterize the basic problem with the economic conversations and so many of the conversations we have in American politics, it's that it's also sort of short-sighted and governed by the concerns of the next election cycle. Even among the vast majority of people who are not running for elected office or tied directly to campaigns, right? I think that we tend to be so focused on quarterly gains in GDP and, the sort of year-by-year uptick or downtick in the unemployment rate that I think that we sort of turn a blind eye to these structural issues that you mentioned, and that gets tied up, I think, in the need for enduring entitlement reforms and other things that actually require strong bipartisan consensus to be able to impact. And you don't get that with the kind of political polarization that we have. But that said, I mean, every political administration gets credit or blame, both really, for things that they do or do not deserve credit or blame for. And you sort of have to judge each administration and each policy in the context in which it comes about. So I'd like to get your take on the Trump administration's economic performance to date. And I'll frame that by saying that obviously there's a wide range of perspectives. I was listening to Paul Krugman a little bit before you and I jumped on. I just went to YouTube and typed in his name to see what he'd been talking about lately and so forth. And, he's hammering Trump on trade, which many people on the right and the left have done. He suggested that the tax cuts, including the corporate tax rate reduction, which was a part of the tax reform bill that the Republican Congress passed relatively recently, would probably do nothing to bring jobs back to this country or to get corporate America to invest in further hiring. So, he had a very negative view. On the other hand, I was listening to the economist Lawrence Kotlikoff on Glenn Loury's program not too long ago. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not. Now, he politically is a person who he actually goes farther than Krugman in terms of his general political opposition to Donald Trump. I mean, Kotlikoff actually has called Trump a traitor, and he's called for his impeachment. So he is as hardcore against the president as you can get politically. And yet, as an economist, he says that the Trump administration's economic performance overall has not really been so bad. He gives them a low B, like in terms of their performance. He's a major critic again on trade. Some people are defending Trump on trade, but when it comes to the tax bill, it was his opinion that it was not particularly unfair, that granted, the same percentage of tax reduction for the wealthier class is going to get you a lot more in terms of absolute gains for them than it's going to give you for poorer people, because poor people make less to begin with, and so the same percentage rate reduction doesn't get you as much, doesn't leave you as much in the bank. But then nevertheless, the tax bill was basically structured in a fair way, and you could expect some reasonable gains across the sort of different income levels. It is true, I think, looking at the data, that GDP has grown since Trump has been in office. Now, it was growing under Obama too, and had been across the course of the recovery. But I looked at the S&P, and I probably should have warned people ahead of time. This is going to be a wonky conversation, so you haven't figured that one out already. Just hang in there with me and Mr. Phillips. But I was looking at the S&P numbers, and I saw where in the last year of Obama's administration, I think we had growth ranging from about 1.3% a quarter to about 1.8 or 9%. And I think in the last quarter that it hit 2.81% under Trump. I think that represents a more aggressive rate of growth under Trump than what you had in the latter period of Obama's presidency. And so maybe we can chalk that up to deregulation and tax cuts and so forth. Seems plausible. On the other hand, if you rewind back to I think about the end of 2015 or so, Obama had a couple of quarters where we did have over 3% growth, one that got close to 4%. So I think that the figures are just, muddy enough for people to sort of look at them and interpret it to see whatever it is they want to see politically in terms of who should or should not get credit. So looking at it as objectively as you can, I'm just wondering, what's your read in terms of what the impact or non-impact of Trump administration policies have been on current economic output?
Of course. So I think what you said is actually spot on, which essentially is that any given quarter of economic data is seen without looking at the broader perspective is not all that particularly helpful. And I mean, it's the nature of the political game that both sides will use whatever data that comes out to spin the story in which best promotes their particular perspective on the issue, or basically essentially promotes their agenda. I mean, certainly there has been an uptick in economic growth rates kind of since like the very end of the Obama administration. That said, there were several years which you had actually higher. Essentially, if you look at the last 4 years of essentially Obama's second term, you actually had a higher economic GDP growth rates during that time than we've had so far during the Trump era, Trump administration. I mean, that said, though, in general, the notion of assigning blame or credit to a president for economic performance, I mean, this has been widely panned by economists as not being particularly relevant. I mean, certainly, I mean, that said, there are, I mean, ultimately, if you think about it, it's so for example, for the tax bill, in both you had, so it was initially kind of essentially sold as being tax reform. And ultimately, I think I would have supported if it was actually true tax reform from the standpoint of basically saying, okay, we need to reduce rates for corporations. Essentially, we had the highest statutory tax rate in the entire, like one of the highest in the entire world, at least within the developing world and developed world, industrialized world, and so that's something which wasn't really conducive to our system. At the same time, in terms of effective tax rates, we had one of the lowest. And that's because we had all these different loopholes. And so basically saying, okay, well, we need to figure out how to reduce the statutory tax rate in order to have a more even effective tax rate across the corporate sector. That to me makes a lot of sense. And ultimately, essentially, what happened was essentially the Trump administration and the Republicans in Congress, and I understand why they did that. Essentially, they reduced the statutory tax rates without necessarily plugging those holes. And so as a result, the tax bill itself did add several $100 billion kind of over the course of like a 5 or 10 year period to the deficit. And so ultimately it's its own form of stimulus. It's its own form of stimulus spending, in this case through tax expenditures instead of through government spending. And it makes sense that you're going to see an increase in 0.1, 0.2, 0.3% economic growth as a result of that. I mean, the more important things, at least from an economist's perspective, is the question of what sort of effect does it have on longer-term growth rates? Does it increase innovation? Does it lead to a more competitive economy? And those are much longer-term questions that you're not going to see in the short term. And that's going to be more of, does that encourage, essentially with lower tax rates on corporate profits, are corporations are they going to invest more in their workers? Are they going to invest more in capital machinery and other capital goods, in which case then there actually could be real benefit to the overall American economy.
Do you expect that to be the case, or is there some evidence so far that corporations are reinvesting their windfall into their workforces?
I mean, certainly investment rates have been up a little bit, but we've been but I guess it's one of those things where it's hard to know it's really hard to tease out how much of that's from the tax bill versus from the fact that you've had strong economic growth for about 9 years now. And that's the second longest economic expansion that we've had since World War II. And so ultimately it makes sense that as unemployment goes down and the labor market becomes tighter, that businesses are going to start investing more in capital expenditures in order to hopefully increase productivity. And so it's one of those things where, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I do not know the answer to that question. I'm not fully trained as a full economist, and I haven't seen enough data, and ultimately that's, and I guess given my experience at the Federal Reserve, I know it's an issue that will be hotly debated among the economist community for the next 10 years. And even then, there'll be a terribly convincing answer. I mean, there'll be more of a sense, but it's, and I'm certainly not in the position right now to give a definitive answer on that standpoint. I mean, and that said, I mean, it certainly has, I mean, overall, I think that the economy has done quite well under President Trump so far. And so it's, in some ways, I think that's why he's been able to maintain the support he has, is because of that. And I think if that changed at some point over the next 2 years, then I think you'd really see the bottom fall out of his political support, especially among Republicans.
Now, how important is just simple general economic confidence or business confidence in actually increasing the health of the economy? I believe that the stock market started to jump up fairly aggressively after Trump was elected, but before he had even taken office. In other words, before any policies or executive actions he might have supported had a chance to go into effect. To what extent is it the case that just feeling good about where the economy might go is actually part of what makes the economy better over time? Is there a placebo factor at play in terms of the growth that we're seeing?
Yeah, no, I mean, as with any human endeavor, animal spirits, and that if you go back to King, that's actually is really important. I mean, I guess for the stock market is forward-looking. It's essentially a present discounted value of future returns. And so I think essentially what you saw happen after Trump was elected and after Republican majorities in the House and Senate was that essentially the market was baking in some assumption that there would be some degree of tax reform, there'd be lower taxes, there would be less regulation, there'd be a number of different steps taken by the administration that would increase corporate profits. And so I guess from that standpoint, I'm not terribly surprised that there was that increase. I think on the flip side, there was at least some concern about what does the election of Trump mean? Does that mean that the United States will pursue a more protectionist trade policy, in which case then that could potentially have a negative impact on economic growth? But yeah, but in general, I mean, that's a large part of where recessions come from is the question of how people are feeling. That if people are feeling, if they're feeling confident for both individuals as consumers as well as for corporations as investors, and basically saying, am I willing to invest several $100 million into a new plant or not? In part, they basically have to say, okay, well, do I expect to see a recession in the next 2 years, the next 5 years? And do I expect a fast economic growth or not? Or do I expect a fairly slow economic growth? And so I guess this probably goes back to, I guess actually maybe the first question you asked, which is what's an issue which people aren't talking about? And it's, I think it's actually one of the mysteries that we're still trying to figure out right now, which is a question of, there's actually been incredible, I mean, over the last 20 years, you've had incredible technological change, and the amount that companies have been investing has actually been quite large. There hasn't been the same productivity growth that we've seen historically, and so I think that's part of the reason why we haven't had the same labor gains, essentially the increases in labor wages that we've had historically. And so that's very much a question that's out there, and there's a lot of different views about why that is, but I think it's an important one, because ultimately I think it drives a lot of the frustration within the broader economy of essentially we see economic growth increasing, we see corporate profits increasing, and a lot of people are saying, hey, why are my wages increasing as well?
Yeah, I'm tempted to jump down the rabbit hole with you a little bit and talk about growth and specifically the sustainability of growth in our current time. But before we do that, I do want to sidestep and just ask you specifically about trade. Now, trade is, I have to admit, I mean, I have never felt that I've had a strong grasp on trade policy. It's not entirely clear to me whether or not trade deficits are or are not on balance a good or bad thing for an economy. I mean, because it to my untrained eye, it seems as if, you hear the word deficit and you think, okay, we're losing money as an economy. But I mean, if we're trading for things that we need, then, it seems like the form of the value exchange has just been changed. We're bringing products and services in that consumers have an easier time purchasing, and that's good for the average American, right? Even if there's an imbalance on the books. What is your feeling about that? What is your feeling about the Trump administration's trade policies? There are people on the right and the left who think that it could be absolutely disastrous in terms of driving up prices for consumers and even making it harder for businesses who have to purchase raw materials, the price of which will be going up. And, obviously there are certain constituencies, many union groups who perhaps stand to benefit from this, and people who believe that the globalization of the economy is a threat to the American worker, et cetera, et cetera. Ties into this whole nationalism narrative, which if you have a take on, I'd love to hear it. But in general, what is your feeling about the Trump administration's trade policy?
I mean, it's definitely, I mean, it's ultimately, it's a mixed bag for me. That I understand where
That's better than being completely catastrophic, though, which,
yeah.
Could have been your answer.
Yeah, so I understand where, I mean, because ultimately Trump actually does have surprisingly strong approval ratings for his trade policy among Republicans, and even historically Democrats have taken a more protectionist perspective on trade, and so there's been a little bit of like a flip-flop on that issue among Democrats and Republicans over the last couple of years. I mean, so I guess the way I look at it is that, so I think, as with all Trump-related issues, I think you have to look at it from, there's a broader issue that he talks about it. I'm not a fan of the way that So I think he identifies real issues. The way he talks about it, it doesn't speak to me. In some ways, I think I find it disingenuous. That said, I think he is talking about some real issues that people really feel. And so, for example, with China, that I mean, certainly for example, when the Chinese were when we negotiated entry of China into the WTO in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, there were certain agreements that we made with the Chinese, essentially about how that process would be normalized, kind of over the coming years with further negotiations, and that hasn't happened. And so I think there is very real concern that the Chinese have figured out how to play by the rules in ways which help them while not playing by the rules, which are essentially a fundamental part of the system. And so from that standpoint, I think that there needed to be a reckoning. That said, I think the Trump administration could have done a much more effective job in what they're trying to do now in terms of pressuring the Chinese to relook at its industrialized policy and its overall tariff rates and the way that it treats American companies and other companies in its markets. I think those are real issues. I think we just would be in a much stronger position if we'd done so from a position of unity and strength across our Japanese, South Korean, or other allies in the region, as well as in Europe as well. Because ultimately, I think a lot of our allies would have gone along with us if we played the leadership role. But instead, by trying to fight trade fronts on 12 different sides, on 12 different fronts, I think we're actually significantly weaker going into that trade negotiation with China than we would be otherwise.
Now, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Well, no, was there what is the strategic reasoning for that from the administration's perspective? I mean, if China, and again, I'm very much of an amateur in this particular area, but if China was sort of the major problem in terms of being a bad faith actor and manipulating currency and doing all of these things to sort of tilt the scales against us, was it not possible for them to sort of focus their efforts on containing China's excesses without punishing our allies with the same set of tariffs and penalties? What was the strategic thinking there, as far as you can see?
I don't know. That's a hard one. At least in part, I feel like for the Trump administration, as for any political administration, there's both a policy reason as well as a political reason behind decisions. And so it's just, I feel like, in particular, I think Trump is very smart. He's in terms of the way he presents his arguments, and I think he figures out how to get people almost how to make arguments on a very emotional level. And so I think trade's a good example of that, of where he's taken something which is a very complex issue and has figured out how to boil it down to the notion of basically all we really care about is the deficit that we have with China, which ultimately, so I think, I guess to clarify what I said before, so I think of a greater concern to me is the fact that the United States has run a global deficit around the entire world for, I'm not sure how many years, but it's been quite a long time. And so that's something which does worry me. That said, the fact that we have a deficit with an individual country such as China, in and of itself is actually not necessarily a bad thing. Simplistic example, which these are all simplistic examples, they don't capture the complexity of it, essentially would be the version of as an individual, I have a deficit with individual people, so for example, my baker or other people who provide services to me.
Okay, we had a...
Sorry.
Good. Okay. We had a brief interruption here. No worries. Blake, you were just in the middle of saying that you are not... you're a bit concerned about our overall trade deficit, but not necessarily concerned about our specific trade deficit with China. Yeah. Yeah. So what was your thought there?
So the simplistic example is that essentially as an individual, I run a deficit with my barber, with my butcher, with other people that I receive services from. That said, I also have a surplus with my employer. And so as a result, essentially, it's a question of what your total, essentially, if you're spending more than you're taking in, then that's problematic. That said, the fact that you have a surplus or a deficit with each individual country is of an issue, at least from a broader economic perspective. I mean, that said, I think the broader concern is the fact that the United States has run a global deficit, for a long, long time. And there's a lot of different reasons for why that is. In general, there's actually a benefit to it as well, which is the extent to which it signifies the fact that other countries essentially want to invest in the United States. They see the United States as a global safe haven. They see the United States as a opportunity for investment. And so from that standpoint, there's actually some benefits to the fact that we do that people want to invest here. And there's a number of complicated relationships essentially between investment and savings, which ultimately defines what your current account and what your capital account, what those look like. And so those are all fairly complicated, and I'm not sure if you want to get into that. But there's, I don't know, it's a complicated issue though.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, so like I said, I wanted to ask you about the subject of growth here, because, you know, one of the things that I think inspired confidence in people, inspired people's confidence in Donald Trump, was the fact that he was making some big promises in terms of just being able to grow the economy in aggregate. And every, you know, presidential candidate tends to make big promises on that front. But you know, he made specific promises, 3%, 4% GDP growth. And even though it hasn't quite reached those levels, you know, it's been going in the right direction, I think. But it's also just been a short period of time. And we know there's a business cycle, there's a boom and bust, and you always wind up running into recessions. And, you know, looking at things year by year is is a different vantage point than decade by decade. Do you believe that we should, in general, be sort of lowering our expectations in terms of the type of growth that is really going to be possible as a regular matter going forward? You may be familiar with the mathematician Eric Weinstein. Are you familiar with Eric Weinstein? Works for.
I'm not familiar with his work though.
Well, right. I mean, he's works for Peter Thiel. He's also the guy who. He's a central figure in the intellectual dark web, if you're familiar with that sort of zone of conversations and so forth. Very bright guy. Yeah. But he made the point, and I'm not quite going to be able to do it justice, I think, but Eric Weinstein has made the observation that coming out of the Second World War, the 50s and so forth, we were in a period, as you and I both well know, of aggressive growth, where the United States of America obviously was in an advantageous position in terms of its relationship with its international partners. Manufacturing was booming. Everything was trending in the right direction. And in accordance with that, people developed a great appetite for greater and greater sort of material growth. I mean, the idea of, sort of the American dream and big Chevy in the front yard and the house with the white picket fence and so forth. People had a sense that the pie was just going to keep getting bigger and bigger. And so that also made it possible for us to grow our expectations in terms of the things the government would be able to provide, more and more expansive social safety nets and pensions, et cetera. And in his analysis over the course of time, as we got into the 70s and the 80s, and all of this is, I guess, just sort of accelerated since then, we had to gradually begin replacing real growth with the illusion of growth. And so in his analysis, this is something that's happened across sectors. You see it in the academic sector with the proliferation of degrees and so forth, giving people sort of the illusion that there's a growth in opportunity, when really all there is a growth in accreditations, but a deflation in the actual, or an inflation in the number of degrees, but a deflation in the actual value of what those degrees can purchase. But that on the financial side, that this need to sort of give the illusion of growth is conveyed through the proliferation of financial methods of financial manipulation and so forth. So we found ways to get stocks to go up in value without there necessarily being a corresponding increase in the real productive capacity of the economy or the individual industries behind marketplace growth. And all these other tricks to make it seem that things are growing and that we're still in an era where opportunities are, there for the picking, when in reality, that era more or less ended a while ago, and people are just now catching up to the reality that, there's just not as much mobility available. There's not as many obvious avenues for real growth, and that we need to sort of catch up with that reality if we're going to be able to manage our situation in the optimal way. I mean, it sounds a little bit pessimistic, but I guess my question to you is that, assuming I did it justice, is that a realistic assessment? How do you look at the prospects for real growth going forward?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that, again, that's also another really tough, complex issue. I mean, also a number of other economists have made some arguments, in particular Robert Gordon, basically talking about, did we have basically go through a period of incredible growth, which came from technological advances that really fundamentally changed the lives of people, going from the late 1800s with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution through sometime in like the late 1980s or 1990s. And because ultimately there has been a decrease in productivity rates. And the question is, where does that come from? And so essentially one theory is that, well, we had an incredible run for about 100 years where it really fundamentally changed the way that people lived with the advent of the automobile and trains and transportation and all the home appliances and just like all the different things. And so right now, and there is incredible technological innovation and change going on. It's a little bit different types though. It's more internet, it's AI, it's in some ways a deeper form of technological innovation from the standpoint, I guess, that technological innovation takes a while for it to move through the economy into people's lives. So one theory is essentially, there's always the idea of, well, it's called Solas Paradox, which essentially is that you see a lot of innovation going on around you, but you don't necessarily see it in the data. You don't see it in the people in terms of workers' wages. And so one hope is that at some point, all of the investment that we're doing into the technology side of the economy right now eventually will pay off. It's just something that might take 5 years, might take 10 years, and that to transmit through. In which case, then we should see a significant uptick in growth. The other part you said, though, I think there is some truth, though, to the extent that the overall size of the financial markets has grown fairly, I mean, basically about 3 times, I think, over the last 30 years in terms of the overall size of the financial markets. And so that is a large difference, and certainly easy money coming from the Federal Reserve and other central banks has been part of that reason for that, as well as I think it's, I don't know, and so it gets into a tougher issue, which is ultimately, I mean, the financial system is an essential part of the global economy. If the financial markets shut down, then that would have a catastrophic effect on people's wages, and essentially the entire economy would come to a halt. That said, though, I think there is valid concern basically saying, well, in some ways, has it almost gotten too big? Or in some ways, have we inflated the prices through easy money? I think there are valid concerns there. And realistically, I guess I don't have the expertise necessary to really fundamentally find the answers to those questions, but I think they are valid questions.
Well, and I think it's certainly fair to say that for people who do not have their wealth directly tied to the market, I mean, obviously, you can draw a connection between where the market's at and, where a person's savings or 401k is, or even a person's job, depending on, everything is interconnected, obviously. But I think that there's a general feeling that, the health of the market is more relevant to people with money than without, right? And so when people see the markets growing and the markets rallying on the one hand, but then they look at their own wages and they see stagnation, there's definitely a sense that growth either isn't real or it represents sort of a manipulating of the system. But putting that part of it aside for the moment, because you we glossed over it a little bit already. But what makes, on the other side of the coin, what makes the wage issue so sticky, in your opinion? Why is it that we just don't seem to be able to get wages, even as the broader economy grows? Why is it that wages continue to flatline as executive compensation skyrockets and the markets go up and the GDP bounces back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different theories to that. For example, if you look at the research from the former, so Jason Furman, who was the former CEA, Council of Economic Advisors chair for President Obama, he's done a decent amount of research looking at the effect that essentially a more concentrated economy, essentially with fewer players at the top, essentially which control a larger percentage of the market, of what sort of monopsony power that they can have in terms of hiring workers. You can look at it from a union standpoint. I mean, I think it's in some ways it's maybe death by 1,000 cuts, that you have at least 100 different explanations, and all which have at least some degree of which have at least some degree of validity to them. I mean, I think overall, it is, again, I hate to go back to it, but it is a really tough issue. And I think I think it's important for people to realize that I think we got used to the idea that wages just automatically go up. And that's kind of just like the way that the world is. And historically, that's actually not been the case. I mean, certainly throughout the vast majority of human history, essentially the productivity of an individual human was fairly stagnant. It was fairly flat. And so I think, so at least one part which I think is missing from the conversation, at least in some part, is that if I mean, in essence, is that the world's changing, and it means that workers have to change too, and that's something which is very hard for people who are in the middle of their careers or who don't have access to education or other ways of basically really adapting to the new economy. And so from that standpoint, it's I mean, so I really understand the frustration. Like, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. I understand that in some ways the rate of change that we as humans can adapt to is actually, there's a limit to it. And I worry in some ways if that limit's if we're surpassing that limit right now. That said, I think there actually is something real about what we're doing. Essentially, we are significantly more effective as an economy. So here's an example. Today we manufacture more today than we ever have in the United States. That said, the amount of manufacturing labor that goes into it is basically about the fourth of what it used to be. And so it's just that we're that much more effective, essentially through automation, through machines, through more effective processes of producing outputs. That said, essentially wages haven't gone up, at least in part because we're doing it through other means instead of through people. And so that's essentially, I think there is a fundamental realignment. Plus, we also are really working within a globalized economy now. And so we have the ability to export, to compete. We were talking about globalized supply chains, which are incredibly complex. They're fascinating, but at the same time, I think they do ultimately limit the market power that American workers have. And I think that's which we got used to in the post-World War II era, in which essentially the US was by far the largest economy around. We had over close to half of the industrial capacity in the entire world. And that's something which, I mean, essentially it's a historical anomaly from that standpoint. And so essentially, I mean, we really are competing, each one of us individually is competing within a global economic context. And so that from that standpoint, it makes sense that people feel less secure. It makes sense that in some ways the wages haven't gone up since the competition has gotten that much fiercer. And so I think and I understand why there's an anger and frustration about that, because in some ways it's a violation of the social contract, which was essentially a fundamental part of our nation, at least for a good 30, 40 years in the post-World War II era. And so the problem is I have a hard time seeing how you put that back together. Essentially, that world no longer exists. And we can pretend it does, but realistically it doesn't. And so I'm not sure the right answer to it. And I guess, and that's where I guess I have less answers than I do have questions for myself. But I definitely worry though, and I think this fundamental issue of stagnating wages and people feeling they have less of a say in their own lives, I think it's part of the reason why you have seen the rise of populist parties, both on the left and also on the right in the United States and in Europe and around the world. And so I think it's not just the United States, it's not just Americans who are feeling frustrated by this. It's a much larger trend there. And it's something which it definitely worries me, and I definitely think a lot about it. That said, I definitely don't have any clear answers for how to resolve this issue though.
Well, our conversation just brings me to the sense that economic problems frequently do not lend themselves to simple answers. And yet, somehow or other, they do tend to lend themselves to simple politics, or so it seems, you know. And that's always been the case. But, you know, I started off our conversation by observing the fact that, you know, the more intractable the problem, the more it is that, at least to my way of looking at things, the more it is that political polarization serves as a real threat to our ability to actually get something done about it, to the extent that political policy, bears upon a certain issue. So people frequently say to me, and maybe you get this too, but you know, people frequently will tell me, or they'll ask me, they'll say, yeah, you know, Americans are polarized, but you know, we've been polarized in the past. Maybe it's a little better now, or maybe it's a little bit worse. But at the end of the day, what does that really have to do with, you know, fixing things on a broad level? The parties are always fighting, you know, but they'll you know, Washington is more or less working in the way it always has. I mean, some people are of that mindset. What is the real threat of polarization in your mind, if you see one, to our ability to engage some of the more intractable economic challenges that the political system perhaps should be addressing? How do you look at that problem as manifesting on that level?
Yeah, I guess my biggest concern there is that I guess what I see around me is I see essentially the majority of the left of essentially there's a fundamental, there's essentially people have lost faith in our economic system, in the titans of capitalism, to essentially in the overall economic system of capitalism to make their lives better.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like they don't have a voice. They feel like it's essentially it's a rigged system. And conversely, I feel like a lot of people on the right, especially more in the libertarians, have lost faith in government. And I think a lot of this goes back to the 2008 financial crisis, essentially where the thing powers that be and kind of existing economic structures and essentially blew up in our faces, and we weren't really quite sure why. And ultimately, everyone felt like they were bailing out someone who they didn't, who screwed it up, and that they were left holding the bag for it. And so I guess I'm concerned that there's a temptation to basically try to push easy solutions or silver bullets, and I guess my concern is that those don't exist. And so I worry a little bit that more centrist parties that try to say, okay, well, you try to really instead of trying to propose policies that won't work but sound good in like from a political standpoint. I guess I worry that I see both sides doing that, and I guess I worry that what the consequences of that will be. That said, I think the debates that we're having right now are healthy. They are. Well, I think we should be. In some ways, I think it's helpful for our society to figure out. I mean, all the fundamental issues that we're debating right now, I think they are healthy. And so the fact that there is division, that there is very different ways of looking at where we are and where we should be, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think, though, that so I think it's a necessary process. I think that I worry about the polarization getting so large, essentially, that it makes it hard for people to have those conversations across those lines.
Right.
Because I think that when you do have those conversations across those lines, I think that's actually where people start to see different sides of the arguments and realize, okay, that there was essentially the world is more complicated than a simple model, or more complicated than they might be thinking about it. Because essentially, I mean, all this, we're all limited. We all have our perspectives. We all have our blind sides. That's I have to remind myself of every day. That I mean, I do know a lot, but there's tons that I don't know. In some ways, the world's filled with things which I don't really understand. And so ultimately, I guess the thing I care about the most is that I feel like by listening to people, I think everyone has their own version of wisdom and has their own personal experiences, and in some ways, we all hold kind of the pieces together to the broader puzzle. And no matter how much research I do, no matter how much there's always parts of it that I'm going to miss. And so I think it's helpful to use the scientific method to basically test hypotheses to see which theories have data behind it, which theories are would have evidence behind it. That said, I think it's really important for people to be very honest about their own experiences and what that means, and especially because we need empathy to be part of that political process, and that part of that political discussion. And so people are hurting out there, and I think they really need to be heard, because I think that's an essential part of our political process, as well as ensuring that whatever decisions that we come to, that they have broad-based support behind them. I mean, that's essentially how we maintain social stability as a country. And so it's, I don't see it as all bad. I see that, and the fact that it is a very polarized moment right now, I think that's not necessarily, I think it reflects a breakup of the existing consensus around a lot of policy issues. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of intrigued to see what ultimately comes out of that, about what new consensus emerges. But in and of itself, I think it's actually a good thing that we are having these vigorous debates and have very different opinions about them. And I just want people to do so while recognizing the common humanity that we all share across those political boundaries.
Yeah, indeed. Well, spoken like a true better angel, Mr. Phillips. And yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in what you just articulated there. I think we really do have to learn to be comfortable with uncertainty. I think we need to be comfortable with the idea that there is an awful lot, no matter how much of an expert you happen to be in these things. There's an awful lot that we tend not to know. And I think that the more we own up to that, the more we may be inclined to sort of lean on each other a little bit, the way we ought to in a democratic society. And so, all that means is that our work continues. So, Blake, it's been a quick hour, my friend, but I really enjoyed it, and I hope that we can get you back on here again to shed some light on some of the things that need light shone upon them. So thank you so much, man. And I'm looking forward to the next.
Appreciate it. It's been good talking with you as well.
Likewise, pal. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.